July 16, 1950, Maracana Stadium, 200,000 people screaming, and one man would carry their hatred for the next 50 years until his death. And this is not a metaphor, this literally destroyed his entire life. Imagine making one mistake at work and having an entire country of 200 million people blame you personally for their greatest tragedy for 5 decades. That was Moacir Barbosa's reality, and what happened to him after that World Cup final is so cruel you won't believe humans could do this to another human. Before I tell you what they did to him, you need to understand that Brazil had already printed victory newspapers. The gold medals were engraved, the victory speech was written, and the team was told to just not lose by more than 1 goal to Uruguay, and they would be world champions. But nobody told Barbosa his life was about to end. The score was 1-1 in the 79th minute. Brazil just needed to hold on for 11 more minutes, and Barbosa had been playing brilliantly, saving shot after shot. But then Alcides Guia received the ball on the right wing, and something happened that would haunt Brazilian football forever. Guia shot from an almost impossible angle, and Barbosa took one small step forward, expecting a cross, but the ball went near post and into the net, and in that millisecond Barbosa went from national hero to the most hated man in Brazil's history. And I mean that literally, not figuratively. The stadium went silent. 200,000 people stopped breathing at the same time. Journalists wrote that it sounded like the end of the world. And in the stands, people were having heart attacks, actual heart attacks. 3 people died, and hundreds fainted, and they all blamed one man. But here's what makes this even worse. Barbosa was actually one of Brazil's best players that day, making multiple crucial saves. If not for him, Brazil would have lost by 4 or 5 goals. But nobody remembered the saves, they only remembered that one goal. And for the rest of his life, that's all anyone saw when they looked at him. The Brazilian people needed someone to blame, and they chose Barbosa not because he was the worst player, but because he was black in a racist society, and because goalkeepers are always the easiest target, and what they did to him over the next 50 years is a crime against humanity. 2 days after the match, Barbosa went to buy groceries, and a woman pointed at him and said to her son, "Look at him, son, he's the man who made all of Brazil cry," and that was just the beginning of a 50-year nightmare that would only end with his death. Taxi drivers would recognize him and refuse to take him, saying they didn't transport traitors. Restaurants would ask him to leave because other customers were uncomfortable. Stores would refuse to serve him, and this wasn't just for a few months or years. This went on for decades. In 1963, 13 years after the match, Barbosa was invited to provide commentary for a match, but when he arrived at the stadium, security wouldn't let him in, saying, "We don't want to risk another tragedy." And this was his life every single day for 50 years. When Barbosa tried to visit the Brazilian national team training camp in 1993, 43 years after the match, the coach saw him and said, "Are you crazy bringing him here? He'll curse us," and made him leave immediately. And these weren't random people. This was the official Brazilian coaching staff. The worst part is that Barbosa kept trying to apologize to Brazil. He would go on radio shows and say, "I'm sorry," over and over, but people would call in and tell him his apology wasn't accepted, that he could never be forgiven, that he should leave the country or worse. In 1970, when Brazil won the World Cup, people celebrated in the streets, but someone threw a rock through Barbosa's window with a note that said, "Now we're champions, no thanks to you," 20 years after his mistake, and they still couldn't let him have peace. Barbosa got married, but his wife left him because she couldn't handle the constant abuse. Strangers would spit at her in the street for marrying the traitor, and his own family members were bullied at school and work just for being related to him. The psychological torture was so intense that Barbosa developed severe depression and alcoholism. He would drink to forget, but every bar he went to, someone would remind him of 1950. Someone would buy him a drink just to throw it in his face and say, "That's for Maracana." In 1980, 30 years after the match, Barbosa's house was set on fire by angry fans who still blamed him, and when the police asked if he knew who did it, he said yes, all of Brazil, and the police officer laughed because he thought it was a joke, but Barbosa was serious. When Brazil hosted the World Cup again in 2014, they invited all living Brazilian football legends to the opening ceremony, except they forgot to check if Barbosa's invitation had been sent because he had died in 2000. But even in planning, they excluded him, showing how even death didn't end his punishment. Barbosa once said the maximum sentence in Brazil is 30 years, but I've been paying for 50 years for something that lasted less than a second. And mathematically, he was right. Murderers got less punishment than he did for letting in 1 goal. The goalposts from that 1950 final were kept as a monument to Brazil's tragedy, and Barbosa once went to Maracana with friends and built a fire and burned them, saying, "These have brought me nothing but sadness," and he was arrested for destroying public property. When reporters asked him about that day, he would cry every single time for 50 years. He never gave an interview without crying. And he would always say, "I'm not a goalkeeper, I'm just a man who once let in a goal," because that's all anyone saw him as. Children who weren't even born in 1950 were taught to hate Barbosa. Their parents would tell them bedtime stories about the evil goalkeeper who stole Brazil's World Cup, and teachers would use him as an example of failure in schools, literally teaching kids that Barbosa equals failure. In 1993, Barbosa was finally invited to a World Cup preparation camp, but not as a coach or honored guest, but as an example. The coaches brought him in to show the players what happens when you fail Brazil, saying this is what you'll become if you lose, using him as a threat. The racism was obvious too because Brazil's white players from that match were forgiven or forgotten, but Barbosa, the black goalkeeper, was marked forever, and he knew it, saying, "In Brazil the god of football is white but the devil is black and I'm the devil." When Barbosa was dying in 2000, he had one last request. He wanted to see the 1950 World Cup trophy that Uruguay won, just to touch it once, but his request was denied because officials said it would be inappropriate, denying a dying man his final wish. On his deathbed, Barbosa's last words were, "I hope this finally pays my debt to Brazil," and even then newspapers ran headlines saying, "Barbosa dies still owing Brazil a World Cup." They couldn't even let him die in peace. After his death, some journalists tried to rehabilitate his image, pointing out that the entire defense failed that day, not just Barbosa, but it was too late. An entire generation had grown up learning to hate him, and that hatred had become part of Brazilian culture. The saddest part is that Barbosa was actually a revolutionary goalkeeper who changed how the position was played, introducing techniques that modern goalkeepers still use, but nobody remembers his innovations. They only remember one moment, one goal, 1 second, that defined 50 years. Today, Maracana has a small plaque mentioning Barbosa, not celebrating him but acknowledging his existence, and even that took years of campaigning from human rights groups who said his treatment was a national shame, but most Brazilians have never seen it. When psychologists study collective trauma, they use Barbosa as an example of scapegoating, where an entire society projects their pain onto one person and destroys them, and what happened to him is now taught in universities as a warning about mob mentality. The mathematician who calculated the angle of Gigia's shot concluded that no goalkeeper in history could have saved it, that the physics made it impossible, but Brazil didn't want physics, they wanted someone to blame, and they chose the black goalkeeper who couldn't defend himself. In 2000, when Barbosa died alone in poverty because he could never hold a job, everyone knew who he was. Only about 30 people came to his funeral, but thousands celebrated online, writing, "Finally the curse is lifted," celebrating a man's death because of one mistake 50 years ago. Today, if you visit Barbosa's grave, it's unmarked because his family was afraid people would vandalize it, and somewhere in an unmarked grave lies a man who was tortured for 50 years for doing his job, for being human, for making one mistake that wasn't even really a mistake. The story of Barbosa isn't really about football, it's about how human beings can be so cruel that they'll destroy someone's entire life over a game. It's about racism, it's about scapegoating, it's about the price one man paid for a nation's disappointment. And if that doesn't make you angry, then you need to check if you still have a heart.